So it was not a long time ago since the 3050 was released, and maybe some of you guys wanted to buy one, but they were sold out fairly quickly. It was not like the earlier cards, I feel, at least not in my market, but where you live that situation was maybe different, and you are still waiting to see if you are gonna buy a 3050. And since I recently also got a hold of a 1650, which is also still being sold at the market, fairly close to the MSRP of the 3050, I think that was interesting video or interesting to test the benchmark between those two cards. Then I also got a hold of a 2060 Super recently that also wanted to test it against these two cards because it's not too far off, and the 2060 Super is like 12 to 10% better than a regular 2060. And I think all of these cards will be priced fairly similarly with a little bit of a difference, but here we will maybe see if it's like worth to buy a 1650 or maybe shell out a little bit more money and going for the expensive cards. So in Warzone I maybe should have tested with higher settings because we are really going into a bottleneck, but I wanted to test it on more of a budget system, so here I'm playing with the i3 because I think that is a system that matches these kinds of cards. And in Warzone the difference between the 1650 and the 3050 and such was a little bit of a big difference, so personally I would go for the 3050 any day, but from 3050 to 2060 Super, which is a better card, the difference wasn't huge at all. And when going into Vanguard, I felt that we saw the exact same results, and I was really surprised. I'm not really sure why, but I had to like look through the video and actually see if I hadn't mixed up these videos. Because we can see a big difference going from a 1650 to a 3050, but then the 3050 is actually better than the 2060 Super. So I'm not really sure why, maybe some of you guys will know that, but looking at the FPS, the 3050 is actually better card. And when looking at the 0.1 and 0.01% lows when it comes to the FPS, which is like showing more of like the stuttering effects and such, we can see that low to like medium settings, the 3050 is performing better here as well, so it's not just the average that are better. We see that we get better low frame rates and an average with the 3050, but it maybe seems like when we move up to the higher settings like high and ultra, we get a slightly better 0.1 and 0.01 lows with the 2060. So that's positive, but we still had lower average frame rate with the absolutely same settings and overall system. The only difference was that it was played 3 days in between these two games, if that made any difference to the updates and such. But yeah, I've sold my 3050 now because I really didn't need it, and it was really not anything that you can use mining either. So I can really keep that card, and for me personally, since I have a 1650 as well that I got for free, I will use that instead in my low budget system. But if I were to buy a low budget system with new cards, I think the value of the 3050 is very good, and at least compared to 1650s that are a little bit overpriced on the market, even though a 1650 works really good, and I wouldn't really go from a 1650 to a 3050 for the upgrade. So it's more if you are looking to buy a new PC. So in Forza Horizon, the results were more what I was expecting. The 1650 having the lowest average, then the 3050, and then the 2060 Super. But in my opinion, all of these cards here perform really well with a good overall performance. Nice graphics that are overall with high frame rates, so really nice and playable. But it seems like there is some issue, and I don't think this is a hardware issue, but maybe with some cards on some CPUs you just have that kind of weird stutter in Forza Horizon, especially when you move up to the higher settings. The averages and such looks totally fine, but you have that slightly like jittery stutter for some reason. And this is something that I have felt on different pieces and such, and also looking at other reviews in Forza Horizon. It seems like people having the same problem, so I think that is something with the game. But overall in the 1650 is handling Ultra fine, I guess. You don't really need the highest kind of frame rates, but we see that we get a decent upgrade in frames when going to better cards. So all of the graphics cards handled flying in Flight Simulator 2020 in the New York area in like a jet with a glass cockpit, which is some of the most demanding tests that you can put on this game to get the lowest frame rates. We see that there is a difference in the FPS between the 1650 and then up to the 3050 and the 2060 Super. But with the 2060 Super and the 3050, the frame rates are basically the same. But when we look in the built-in FPS meter in Flight Simulator itself, we can see that we get a little bit better performance and headroom with the 2060. So we could put it up to maybe 1440p to put even more load on the GPU. Because here we are bottlenecked by the main thread in the CPU, and overall Flight Simulator is a really graphically intensive game, both I guess for the CPU because of having to build a lot of buildings and things going around or happening in the game, but then also graphically demanding of a lot of textures and such that needs to be loaded into the game. So playing with the 1650 in Ultra when it comes to the average maybe seems fine, because 29 FPS should be enough for a flight simulator for it to feel smooth, but I think there's something to do with the overall frame time and the frame dips here. So even though the average here maybe seems fine, it's not really playable, at least in this area with this plane. But when going to the 3050 and the 2060 Super, they are performing fairly good. We can see that the performance between the 3050 and the 2060 Super when it comes to average frame rates is basically the same, but that is because we mostly are CPU bottlenecked, and we can also really see that on the percentage of the GPU use. With the 3050 in Ultra, we are maybe going from 80 and up to 100%, but with the 2060 Super we have much more headroom, and here flying at almost the same place we are maybe maximum of 60%, but we are limited by the main thread here in Ultra, so we won't get more frame rates. But if you had a much better CPU with a much higher single core clock, you would expect to get more frames, or you can go to 1440p to put more load on the GPU.